everybody, this is Lori, and I just wanted to pop in kind of quickly today and show you a very fun project that features some of the new products in the new mini catalog and also the Sale-a-Bration brochure. And both of these are going to go live on Tuesday, next Tuesday, January 4th, and I hope you're as excited as I am about these. I'll tell you what though, when I hear January 4th, I don't know about you, but I'm literally recording this right now on New Year's Day, kind of in the middle of the afternoon. And here in North Carolina, it's in the upper 70s. It's crazy. I've got the window open and just trying to get some fresh air in here. But I wanted to show you that it is really fun and quick to make a card from some of the designer series paper that is available in Sale-a-Bration, and we're going to add just a few other elements, these butterflies that are in the new catalog, to this card. But let me show you how quick and easy it is to make this. And if you haven't seen the paper that is in it's called Daffodil Afternoon, and it has some stunning pieces of paper. They're kind of on a background of very vanilla, and they've just got gorgeous colors. Mossy Meadow and Pear Pazzazz, Daffodil Delight, and some other really pretty pastel colors. But I wanted to choose a color that I thought was just really vibrant and worked really well. So I chose one of the pieces from the designer series paper, and I'm going to just jump in because I think that's the best way to create this card. I am starting with a piece of designer series paper that is 2 3/4 inches wide, and I purposely left this to 6 inches high. And there's a reason for that. I wanted to make sure that I had plenty of height because I will end up trimming this, but I didn't want to trim it quite yet, and it will become a little bit more clear as we go through. But start with a piece of paper that is, again, 2 3/4 wide by 5.5 inches tall. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to cut this into 3 pieces. And if you have a piece of designer series paper that has a pattern, make sure that it is in the vertical orientation if you're going to be making a portrait card. You could definitely make a landscape card with this kind of design as well. You just have to change up the dimensions of your paper a little bit. I'm going to cut this so that my widest piece is going to be on the right. You can see I'm ending up with 3 pieces. I've got a wide piece, one that's a little narrower, and then the third is narrower yet. And the first one that I'm going to cut is going to be on the left side. I'm going to cut that piece to 1.5 inches, but I'm going to turn that around just because it's easier for me to line up my paper if I have it in this orientation so that I can see the 1.5 inches going from my cutting blade to the left. So I've cut that at 1.5. Now if I just reorient this paper, you can see that we now have 2 pieces. This piece on the left I want to cut into 2. And I don't know about you, but sometimes if I have a piece of paper that's a little bit narrow and I try to get it, aligned in my paper cutter and then put the gate down, I don't always get it exactly where I want it to go. So I saw this great tip that if you take a piece of Post-it note and you attach it, and I'm going to attach mine on the left side of my designer series paper. This kind of extends my hand because I'm going to be able to move this back and forth, and I'm also going to be able to actually sort of stick it down to where I want it to cut on the trimmer. I want to cut the second piece to 7/8 inches wide. And what's nice about that piece of Post-it note is that is holding this piece of paper down. So when I close the gate and I cut it at 7 1/8, I am assured that that paper has not moved, and it is going to cut exactly where I want it to be. So let me move this off, and I will show you that now I've got the 3 pieces. I've got one that ends up at 3/8 of an inch. This is 7/8 of an inch, and this one is 1.5. And they are going to be put back onto a piece of paper that will end up being my backdrop. I chose Mossy Meadow for this. I thought it was really nice in bringing out some of the darker greens in the background. And this is cut to 4 inches by 5.25. So it's a 1/4 inch narrower and a 1/4 inch shorter than an A2 size card. And I'm building a border. And you know me well enough that I'm going to build some borders around the card. So this is the piece that we're actually going to adhere those 3 pieces of designer series paper. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the largest piece. I'm just going to purposely put my pieces kind of in the order that I know I'm going to adhere them to my card. And I find it easier. What I want to end up with is I want to end up with this piece adhered to the bottom, flush with the bottom and flush with the edge. So what I'm going to do is grab some glue, and I definitely recommend liquid glue for this. You want to have a little bit of wiggle room as far as having enough time to get your piece set. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to line up the piece that I'm going to glue right by the edge of the piece that I will glue it to. And what I don't want to do is visually go past that edge. I'm trying to keep the glue within the boundaries of where I'm going to be putting this piece of paper onto that Mossy Meadow background. And I'm just going to add a little bit of glue. I don't need to do an awful lot, because another thing that we will do is we're going to emboss this, dry emboss it. And then what I find easy is if you kind of lean both pieces of paper toward you. So I have the designer series paper and my cardstock so that they're both on the edge of my little blotter piece down here. And I line them up so they're nice and flush. And you can see if I turn it over, it definitely looks like I got it right at the corner. And I'm just going to give it a little bit, just a tiny bit of a push. I'm not going to trim this paper off yet because I want to make sure that I'm getting my pattern lined up. And what I'm doing is I am grabbing my Stamparatus. And you're probably wondering, why in the world are you doing that? Because nothing that I'm actually doing in the next couple of steps has anything to do with stamping. But a Stamparatus is so much more than a stamping tool. It is actually really, really helpful as a second pair of hands when you're doing projects like this, because what it will do is it will allow you to line things up so that you can see them a little bit better in terms of where they're going. You're going to have to forgive the piece of paper that I have that I'm going to put into my Stamparatus, because I've just got a ton of stamped images on it, but it will prove my point anyway. So I'm going to bring this in. Again, ignore all the crazy stamping that I have going on here. But I just want to show you how you can use this as a second pair of hands when you're doing something like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm lining this piece, the one that I just put down on my piece of paper, and I'm lining it up so that I've got that little perforated line, and it's going to show me when my paper is straight. And I'm going to go ahead and use my magnets and just hold that down. Now this comes in super handy because the next piece of paper I want to put in so that it is nice and straight. I want to try to get the gaps between my designer series paper as it's going down as straight as I can. And this is just an absolutely brilliant way to do it. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to flip that over, and just like I did on the first piece, I'm going to put some glue, and I'm being careful-ish. I'm just making sure I'm not going outside the boundary. I'm not going to be gluing past the Mossy Meadow that's on the bottom. And again, I don't really care if I've got glue in the absolute right place. And then I'm going to flip that over. And what you're going to see is, because of the width, it's a little bit tricky because of where I have my stamping. But right at 4 1/4 on the grid paper, I've got a line that goes all the way over to the other side, and I'm just lining that up. And then I'm really assured that the gap in between those two pieces is where I want it to be. Who knew? Who knew that a Stamparatus could be such a useful tool? And then this last piece, I'm going to line up so that it's at actually 3 1/4. If I look at this the right way, that would have been at 3 3/4. But I'm just going to line this up at 3 1/4, and then I've got another line over here on the left, and I can make sure that that's all nice and straight. So the last thing I'm going to do, and on this one, I'm really not going to put a lot of glue. It's a thin piece. It's 3/16 of an inch wide. I'm sorry, 3/8 of an inch wide. So all I did was put a kind of a bead of glue all the way down, and I'm just going to line that up on the left side and on the right side, and I'm going to make sure that that looks nice and even in terms of spacing. All right. So as you can see, I've purposely made sure that my design is in the right orientation. It will be so much easier to see this if I take it out of the Stamparatus, because then you're not going to be staring at stamped images. But what's really fun is the pattern goes all the way through. So when I was putting this together, I grabbed some scrap paper, and I purposely looked at the other colors that are in this package of designer series paper. And I guess this is why I don't throw scrap paper away. And I'm sure you guys don't either. We all have tons and tons of it in different parts of our craft room. And I decided that I wanted to just put a little bit more of a border of color. And I chose 2 of the colors that are in the designer series package. One is Daffodil Delight, and that's the one that is on the right. That is cut to 1/4 of an inch. And then the one that's on the left is Pear Pazzazz, and it's the lighter of the greens that is showing in the actual designer series paper. That is cut to 3/16 of an inch. And I thought it would be kind of fun to have different widths of those pieces, because we have different widths of the designer series paper. So very similar to what I did with the other pieces, I'm just going to glue these, but I'm not going to put a gap in between these pieces and the designer series paper, and I'm not going to put a gap between these 2 colors of cardstock, because I want it to look a little different. So this is very easy. All you're doing is butting up those pieces of color. I'm just trying to get this so that it is really pulled tight. So I'm actually kind of pulling it toward me and making sure that it's flush up against the left side. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing with this little piece, which is Pear Pazzazz in color. And again, just a little bit of glue. I'm lining this up so that I can see when I'm going to get to the end. So about right there. I don't need to put more glue, because if I do, I'm just going to get it on my piece of paper when I glue it down. Just going to turn that over. Going to bring that right next to the Daffodil Delight. Push that just a smidge. And there we go. And don't worry if you get a little bit of glue that's oozing out of the bottom. Technical term, oozing. And here's where we are right now. And things are nice and straight because I use the Stamparatus to make sure that the pieces of the designer series paper are nice and straight as well. So now, trimming. Turn it over. Always trim from the back when you have pieces of paper that you want to align with another straight edge. And one thing that I suggest is that you cut full pieces. So when I was cutting that, my blades were starting to go together, and if I kept going, they would have closed midway through this piece. I don't like to do that. I like to make sure that I have an open blade when I'm cutting a single piece of paper. It just seems to trim it off a lot better. So I'm just going to come in there and I'm going to snap that off. And I'm going to turn it over to the other end, and I'm pretty good. If there were any things that were sticking out, I might trim that a little bit, but it looks pretty darn good. So there we've got our main focal point. And let's just do a comparison. Here's where we want to go on the left. Here's where we are on the right. So we've got our backdrop all set. And there's some subtle things that you may not be able to see on camera incredibly well. One of the things that I really like to do is add texture to the cards. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to run this piece, the one that we just put together, I'm going to run that through an embossing folder. And this is one of my go-tos right now. I love this embossing folder. It, just like it says in the name, Tasteful Textile, it gives a really clean texture to the embossing, and it makes it almost look like it's cloth. It is a 3D embossing folder, so when you put it through your machine, you do have to be mindful of the sandwich that you're going to use. And the sandwich involves using a specialty plate. This embossing folder is a little bit thicker than some of the other embossing folders that are on the market and we typically use. And the reason that you want to use the specialty plate is it's going to give you just a nice deep embossing, and it's one that is readily available. My embossing die cutting machine is a little ancient. Please do not pass any judgment. And I know watching somebody do dry embossing is definitely not super exciting. But I really do think that if you take the time and you put a little bit of texture onto a design like this, it just adds a little bit more interest to your card. So I'm going to get the machine out of the way. Another thing that dry embossing this is going to do is it is going to help the paper adhere together even better, because as I put that piece through the embossing folder, there was a lot of pressure that was being put on the top and the bottom. So that gluing that I did is even better now. This isn't going anywhere. It is staying put. And I wish you could see this in person. If you don't have that embossing folder, I really highly recommend it. This looks like a piece of cloth. It is just, it's really pretty. So again, let me bring the original back in, the finished card. We don't have a lot yet to do, so I want to bring in the other pieces. The card base that I used is very vanilla. I cut it into an A2 size. So initially this was 8.5, 5.5. It scored at 4 1/4 on the 8.5 inch side, in half, so you have a really nice clean card. The background in some of the paper is very vanilla, and it just goes really well. And then you may or may not be able to see that behind the focal point that we've been working on, there is a black border. And it's a very subtle border. I did that intentionally. I wanted to have a definite frame to the background, and then I really wanted to have a color that is in the designer series paper, because what happens is when you do that, this designer series paper almost melts into the background and you really don't see that color. And if you have any areas where maybe the designer series paper came off your, in my case, the Mossy Meadow color, you're not going to see it as much if you use a predominant color that's in your designer series paper piece. This I cut to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. So it's just 1/8 of an inch shorter and 1/8 of an inch narrower than the card base. And in an opposite way, it's just a teeny bit wider and longer than the focal point. So it really does make a nice frame. And I'm just going to put that black piece directly on top of the card base. All right. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is eventually put the card focal point onto the black frame that I just put down. But before I do that, I want to add a little bit of a design with a piece of twine. And what I'm going to do for that is use a piece of, this is called Simply Elegant Trim. It comes in gold and silver. You can see I've used it quite a bit. And I'm just going to take out some of the gold. Again, I thought that worked really, really well with the coloring. And we're going to add some more gold embellishments in just a minute. And I'm going to use a super technical tool, some Scotch tape, to help me on this part. I'm going to get the base out of the way for just a minute. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to tape the back of the ribbon to the back of my card. And I'm putting it so I've got a good probably 8 inches or so hanging off the right hand side. I'm not making this super scientific. I'm just going to turn that over, and then I'm going to put a couple of pieces of tape onto the trim. And eventually I'm also going to put some glue onto that tape to hold it down. And I'm kind of eyeballing it to try and get it sort of straight. It really isn't going to matter at the end. So just taping that down. And then I'm going to bring it over to the front. Now, on that left-hand side, the one that's still on the spool, I don't cut things off a spool until I know how much I'm going to use. I'm going to wrap it around once, and then I'm going to bring it to the front, and I'm just going to loosely tie a little bow. And this is going to be where I'll end up having a cute little bow that's going to be tied. Now, this is a brilliant tip that a good friend of mine told me. And for those of us who struggle with making bows, especially when there are pieces that are twine, or in this case trim, that you wish you had 3 hands to tie your bow, here's another thing that works really well to help you get things squared away. Glue dots. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put a glue dot on the space where I want my bow to be. And in doing that, I'm going to give my trim something to adhere to. And this is such an obvious tip, but it's one of those when you think about it and you think, oh, I wish I'd thought of that. You know, so I've got my trim kind of lined up here, and let's say that's where I want my bow to go. So I'm just going to put my glue dot down right there. Now, when I pull this around, and I just make sure that my trim is going to go over where I put my glue dot, and I come back in, and I'm going to put that trim, that piece, all the way under. So I'm bringing it down underneath both of those pieces that I've got, and I'm just going to find my little glue dot, and I'm going to push it down. Isn't that brilliant? That's staying. That's not moving. And now I have the ability to futz around with this crazy bow. This is where I go a little nutty trying to tie a bow, but at least I'm not trying to hold the rest of the trim down because that glue dot is doing the job for me. Because can you imagine if I was trying to do that and I'm trying to tie this little bow? I'd be going crazy. All right, so I'm going to pull that taut, and I'm also going to push that down, and then I'm just going to pull the edges back until I get the size that I want. And this is totally up to you. Whatever size you want. This trim, I'm going to tell you, really pulls tightly. It's really nice. It works really well. And then I'm going to trim that off just a bit, give myself a little bit more than I know I need. And I have my little bow tied. Isn't that pretty? Just a nice, elegant little piece that will end up giving a little bit more elegance and just a little bit of bling. And what's also nice is since I did that glue dot in the middle and I've done my tape on the back, the sides on this card I can still move around. I can bring that trim up or down. I can position it where I want it to be, and I don't necessarily need to have it perfectly aligned front to back. All right, again, left, that's where we're going. Right, that's where we are. So let's kind of finish this one up. I'm going to bring back my card base, and I am going to glue this down. I am truly going to just glue it down. And the one thing that I find is when I have trim that's a little bit thicker, this is thicker than baker's twine. It just has a little bit more depth to it. I really want to get close to where that twine is, but I'm not even going to pretend that I'm going to be able to glue that down. It won't work. It's too thick. But I also, because I'm using a piece of cardstock that has been dry embossed, that cardstock has texture. And I put kind of blobs of glue in the corners because I want to make sure that my corners are where I want them to be. Now, make sure you have your card in the orientation that you want it. So I know I'm opening it on the right, and then I have the piece that I'm going to adhere to the top. And I'm just going to align that as best as I can. I know where I put the glue down, so I've got glue on the outside. I've also got glue right by where I put that trim. So I'm going to give that a nice push just to make sure that everything is going to sit and not move. I struggled, I'll be honest with you, in finding a sentiment that I really liked, that I thought was appropriate for the new year. And I wanted to do something that didn't say, Happy New Year 2022. I'm not really sure why, but I wanted it to be, yeah, I am sure I know why. I wanted it to be a little bit more uplifting. We've all struggled over the last couple of years, and I just wanted to have something that might carry us through the year. I also thought this sentiment worked really well with the flowers in the designer series paper. And this comes from a stamp set that is in the annual catalog. You can see it's right here. May good things grow all year long. We all need that right now, that's for sure. And I stamped that with Mossy Meadow to tie in with the cardstock that I used in the background. And then I wanted a clean but interesting die to use to cut that sentiment out. And the die that I chose is this one. It is from the Painted Labels dies. And again, this is in the annual catalog. You may or may not be able to see this. I'm going to turn the die over. It's probably easier to see with the die. The die doesn't just cut, it also embosses a really nice edge all the way around that shape. So it just gave it something a little bit more interesting, I thought. And I also didn't want something square because there's a lot of square going on with the card. There's a lot of rectangular, there's a lot of straight, and I wanted it to be just a little bit different. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tuck that right up against my bow. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you do this is I'm going to put dimensionals on this. I want it to pop up a little bit because we've got a little bit of this has a thickness, so I need to pull it up a little. Well, when I do that, I've got to be careful that I'm not going to stick dimensionals on top of this twine because then this isn't going to lay flat. So a good way to do this, and you'll see I goofed on the first time that I did my sentiment. That's why God invented two sides of paper. But if I turn my sentiment over, and what I'm just doing here is I'm making sure that when I put my dimensionals on, and I am going to cut these in half, they're just going to work a little bit better, that I'm putting the dimensionals in a way that that twine is going to go through the middle. And I won't have a dimensional sitting on top of a piece of twine because, again, it won't sit on the top of my paper if I have a dimensional that is in the way. And this is just a great thing to keep in mind if you have twine, ribbon, anything that has bulk. So I've sort of built a little channel in the middle of my sentiment, and I'm going to make sure that I'm not getting a dimensional there. And I love dimensionals. And then I always go back and just make sure if I touch the exposed pieces that there is sticky on all of them. And I'm just going to tuck this in. I'm not going to get super crazy. I'm going to try to get it straight. And then I'll just go ahead and push that down. And before I get really serious about pushing it down, I'll just come over to this side and make sure that it looks lined up when I'm looking at it head on. And what's also nice is I still have the ability to move the twine around just a little bit to wherever I want it to go. And then I can trim my twine. I don't want this to look super fancy or super perfect. I want that twine to look like it is a little bit organic because we're working with flowers. You're going to notice that if I do the original and the one that we are doing together, they look different. Of course they're going to. The patterns in the paper are different. Where I put the twine, this is lower. Where I put the sentiment, it's off to the left a little bit. It doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. Each card is going to have its own unique personality, and that's half the fun. And then I thought I'm going to use some of these amazing, these are called brushed brass butterflies. They also work well together with gold. They're kind of, in my opinion, a goldy brass color, so you're not limited in only using them if you have, like I have a gold trim on here, but I can get away with these without a problem. And they have an adhesive on the back, and I kind of like the way I put them on the first, where I've got one sort of flying on the sentiment, and then I've got another large one. They come in two sizes. I wanted to show off the different colors of cardstock, so I made sure that that one is sort of staggering between two pieces of cardstock, different colors. And then I brought in an itty bitty one that's sticking to my finger. There we go. And I'm just going to put that one right here. So there you have it. Now, a nice thing about a design like this is you can use this with any designer series paper, any sentiment, any kind of ribbon. This is a design that will allow you to look at your supplies and create cards with these dimensions in many different ways. I want to show you one more that I did, and this is a birthday card. This is obviously very different. So if you look at these side by side, you can see that the elements are the same. The designer series paper is the same size. I cut them all to the same width. I use the accent of different colors that are in the designer series paper. The die is the exact same die. Obviously the sentiment is different. The embellishments are different, and the ribbon is different. And let me tell you where these came from. The paper. Oh my word. If you think you have enough paper right now, you don't. You don't. I can't tell you even more emphatically than that. This paper is in the new Mini Catalog. It is beyond gorgeous. It is called Flowering Fields, and it is absolutely stunning. And I love the way all these colors come together. They're just amazing. The sentiment that I used on that comes from the Friendly Hello, which is a Sale-a-Bration stamp set. This is a level 2 because there is corresponding designer series paper with this set, with this stamp set. You can actually use, for example, this dual flower stamp, and you can stamp that onto the designer series paper. The background on this is rich raspberry, and the paper that I used is, this is also Pear Pazzazz, same as over here. This is Highland Heather, and then the ink on that is the rich raspberry as well. And the ribbon, this ribbon is currently on the clearance rack, and it actually comes with another ribbon. These come in a set, and I want to say it's $3 or $3.50. It's called Forever Greenery. This is a copper ribbon. It's gorgeous. I've made Christmas cards with it, and I just loved the way that that copper played against the colors in the designer series paper. And then on this one, I popped in a couple of genial gems, and I used the ones that are the green. I just thought that they worked incredibly well. So I hope I've inspired you. I will put in the information as far as what the dimensions of the paper are, but I'm just going to remind you really quickly what the paper dimension is for the designer series paper. You start with 2 3/4 by, I cut it to 6. This is 1.5 inches wide. The next is 7/8 inch wide, and that leaves you with 3/8. In this case, Highland Heather is 1/4 inch, and the Pear Pazzazz is 3/16 of an inch. But I will give you all of that. I hope you like these cards as much as I do, and I hope that you will use this design to create a lot of different cards for different sentiments, different reasons. And it's a great way to use up the designer series paper in your stash. And don't forget, on Tuesday of next week, January 4th, both the Mini Catalog and the Sale-a-Bration brochure will go live. And many of the products that I used for these two cards are available in those. So thanks so much for joining me. Happy stamping, Happy New Year, and may 2022 be a good year for all of us, and hopefully we can get through this pandemic together. Thank you again. See you soon. Bye-bye.